The train screamed as it ground against the rails, steel shrieking over the desert silence. Dust leapt from the ground in a wild cloud, carried by the hot wind across the platform. Elias Grady stood apart from the cluster of townsfolk, boots planted, hat brim casting his eyes in shadow. His hand worked against the cracked leather of his belt, thumb restless, though his face never moved. A single figure stepped down from the last car. Small, straight-backed, a plain dress of pale gray clung to her thin frame, and in her hands she clutched a wooden box as though it were life itself. Her black hair shone like a raven's wing under the pitiless sun. The murmur began at once. "That ain't her. Lord above, the fool's been had. She don't speak a lick of English. You can tell." The laughter rose sharp and cutting, spilling from the saloon porch across the tracks. Men with bottles in hand leaned over the rail, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. A pair of painted women giggled behind gloved fingers. The sheriff, lounging with his thumbs in his vest, allowed a low chuckle that carried across the platform like a hammer on an anvil. Elias's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked once to the small woman who stood with her chin lifted, her gaze fixed not on the crowd but on the horizon beyond them all. No word passed her lips. She held that box close and stood in the storm of ridicule without flinching. A gust rattled the tin roof above, sent grit stinging against skin. Elias moved. Heavy boots struck the boards, echoing loud enough to hush the nearest jeer. He crossed the distance slow, each step deliberate, until he stood before her. Her eyes met his. Dark, steady, a silence stretched there, taut as barbed wire. He reached for the box. She pulled it tighter to her chest. The corners of her mouth tightened. Not fear, but resolve. Elias let his hand fall. He gave the faintest nod. She answered with one of her own. Behind them, a gambler called out, "Hey, Grady, thought you ordered yourself a wife, not a mute ghost." Laughter ripped across the platform like gunfire. Elias turned, gaze cold as a canyon shadow. The voices faltered one by one. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, he tipped his hat lower, offered his arm. The woman hesitated, then slipped her hand lightly against his sleeve. Together they walked past the gaping crowd, boots and slippers striking the dust in rhythm, toward the open desert road that stretched empty and endless. The sun beat down merciless, and the wind carried the echoes of laughter after them, but neither looked back. Far ahead, hawks circled. The land waited, and so, without a word, they began. The hammer struck the post, and splinters flew. Elias drove the fence rail into place, sweat rolling down his neck, shirt clinging with dust and labor. The stallion inside the pen snorted, muscles bunching, eyes wild from the lingering smoke of last night's fire. Lime stood beyond the rails, skirts tugged by the hot wind, a bucket of water in her hands. She moved slow, quiet, each step measured as she raised the bucket toward the animal's muzzle. Steam rose from the scorched earth where the barn once stood, black timbers still smoldering, the air thick with ash. The stallion pawed the dirt, ears flat, and Elias's hand shot out, ready to drive him back. But the beast stopped at the sight of her stillness. The bucket tipped, water spilling into the trough. Her hand brushed the animal's nose, calm as the settling dusk. The stallion drank. From the ridge, hoofbeats thundered. A line of riders crested the rise, silhouettes cut sharp against the burning sky. Dust boiled up around them, carrying their laughter ahead of their arrival. Elias's hammer stilled. The lead rider lifted his hat with a mocking wave. Silas Crow, broad-shouldered, scarred jaw, gray coat faded for more, sat tall in a saddle. His men fanned out, rifles glinting in the last of the sun. "Fine spread you got here, Grady," Crow called, voice like gravel dragged across stone. "Be a shame if it burned down again." The stallion tossed its head. Lime stepped back, her eyes never leaving the riders. Elias's hand tightened around the hammer, then dropped to the rifle leaning by the fence. Crow's smile bent cruel. "Week's end. That's all you've got. Sell the land, or I'll carve your name into the dirt myself." His men hooped and spat, horses stamping, spurs clinking sharp. The wind carried the stench of sweat, and smoke. Elias raised the rifle half an inch. Crow's pistol was already leveled. Silence clamped down, thick and heavy. The air seemed to wait. A sudden rattle broke it. The stallion kicking the trough aside, water spilling over dust. Limay stepped forward, hand raised between the guns as if commanding silence. Her face gave nothing, but her eyes burned steady. Crow's gaze lingered on her, puzzled for a breath. Then he laughed, low and mean. "Even your woman knows you're finished, Grady." With a tug of his reins, he wheeled his horse. The gang followed, thunder rolling down the ridge until only dust hung in the air. Elias lowered the rifle. His knuckles were white, jaw stone tight. Beside him, Limay set the bucket upright again, her hand brushing ash from its rim. Her silence said more than any word. The fire in the timbers hissed, whispering what the wind already knew. The storm had only begun. The bodies dragged behind the horses left dark trails in the dirt. Dustwater's main street stood frozen. Townsfolk pressed against warped doorframes, eyes averted, breath caught in their throats. Silas Crow reined in his black horse, the animal frothing at the mouth, its hooves striking sparks against the hardpan. The merchant's face was bruised and bloodied, his shirt torn where the rope cinched his chest. Crow cut him loose with a flick of his knife, dumping him in the street like spoiled meat. The outlaw's voice rang through the hush. "Grady's ranch falls to me by week's end. Any man standing in my way will share this one's fate." The crowd rippled back, no one daring to speak. A child whimpered until his mother's hand silenced him. Crow's men rode wide circles, rifles loose in their hands, boots clinking against stirrups. At the far edge of the street, Elias stood stiff by the hitching post, hat shadowing his eyes. His hand rested on the worn stock of his rifle, though he hadn't lifted it. He said nothing. From the boardwalk, Crow's gaze found him. "You hear me, rancher? The land's mine. Don't test me." The words cut through the dust, sharp as spurs. Elias's jaw shifted, but his answer was only a flat, steady, "This land's mine." A murmur rose from the crowd. Crow's smile spread like oil on water, slow and poisonous. He spat, swung into the saddle, and rode off, his gang trailing behind in a storm of dust and mocking laughter. When the haze settled, Elias was still. The townsfolk melted back into their homes and shops, leaving only silence and the smell of horse sweat lingering in the air. A light hand touched his arm. Limay stood at his side, her face calm, her eyes locked on his. She said no word, but her grip carried weight, steady as stone. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth. Elias sat at the table, rifle laid across his knees, oil rag moving in slow circles along the barrel. Limay crouched on the floorboards, the wooden box before her. She lifted the lid, reverent, her movements deliberate. Steel glimmered in the firelight. Twin blades, short, curved, polished to a quiet shine. Her hands brushed along their edges with practiced care. Shadows danced against the wall as she slid one free, the faint hiss of steel parting wood cutting through the silence. Elias's rag stilled. His eyes lingered on the blade, then on her face. She met his gaze without flinching. The flames cracked and spit, throwing sparks upward. Elias set the rag aside, fingers resting firm on the rifle. Limay laid the blade across her knees, head bowed, lips moving in a whisper the fire swallowed whole. The silence between them grew taut, not empty, but charged. A word passed his lips, quiet, rough, as if dredged from a well long dry. "Family." Her mouth shaped the sound slowly. Once, then again. The fire answered with a sharp pop, as if sealing the vow. The thunder of hooves shattered the dawn. Dust rolled across the ranch like a living wall, the gang pouring over the ridge in a wave of snorting horses and glinting steel. The air trembled with their whoops and curses, the crack of gunfire already spitting against the sky. Elias stood in the yard, rifle braced against his shoulder, hat brim low. He fired once. One man toppled from the saddle. He worked the lever, fired again. Another horse reared, throwing its rider into the dust. But the tide did not slow. The stallion screamed in its pen, kicking the rails. Flames licked the memory of the barn in Elias's mind, the crackle of old fire echoing in his chest. His hands were steady, but his body staggered under the sheer press of men flooding toward him. Then she moved. Lime stepped from the doorway, blades in both hands. Her dress whipped in the storm of dust, her hair black against the pale light. She ran forward with a burst of speed, her body low, striking sharp as lightning. The first man laughed until her blade drew a red smile across his throat. His laughter ended in a gurgle lost beneath the roar. The gang shouted, curses rising in disbelief. Bullets tore the air, but she was already gone, spinning, striking, cutting through the press with a precision born of old battles far from this land. Elias's rifle cracked again and again, each shot carving open a path, each shot driven by a weight deeper than rage. His grief was no longer hollow. It was fuel. The yard filled with screams and gunfire, the stench of sweat and blood heavy as smoke. Horses crashed against each other. Men fell screaming into the dirt. Still the pair held, the ranch standing behind them like a stubborn fortress. At last, Crow charged forward. His pistol roared, the bullet tearing Elias's hat clean from his head. The rancher staggered, then slammed the rifle, but against Crow's jaw. The outlaw hit the dirt, rolling, coming up with his knife bared. Elias swung the rifle, but Crow was quicker, blade flashing. Wood splintered, the rifle knocked wide. Crow lunged, steel aimed for Elias's heart. A cry cut the dust. Lime struck from his side, her blade slicing Crow's wrist. The knife clattered into the dirt. His scream was raw, wild. Elias's hand closed on his revolver. He leveled it, eyes cold as canyon stone. The shot rang out flat and final. Crow fell back, silence rushing in behind him. The dust settled slow. The gang lay broken, scattered in blood and ruin. The townfolk stood on the ridge, wide-eyed, hushed. They had come to watch a rancher fall. Instead, they witnessed a legend rise. Elias lowered his revolver. Beside him, Lime sheathed her blades, her face unreadable but her eyes fierce. He looked at her, breath ragged, and spoke the word once more, soft, certain. Family. The desert wind carried it away, to be caught in campfires and saloon corners for generations.